Assignment 6, Cultural Perspective on Leadership. Jackson and Perry 2011 cited several authors and researchers to illustrate the significance of context, and specifically cultural context on leadership. Leadership is essentially a cultural activity. It is suffused with values, beliefs, language, rituals, and artifacts. Jackson and Perry 2011, page 71. As well, Chin and Gagne 2006 stated it is evident that no company can afford to neglect the cultural context of leadership, and that no manager has the luxury of ignoring cultural differences. This presentation will examine cross-cultural leadership and the concept of cultural intelligence. What are they and why they are relevant? As well, personal cross-cultural leadership experiences will be shared to illustrate the importance of this leadership skill set. Before we begin, let me introduce our team of varied members. Our team is comprised of members from across Western Canada, from varied backgrounds and upbringings. Brett Elmgren, Saskatchewan, Charlene Dishaw, British Columbia, Jackie Ryan, Alberta, Christine Trin, Alberta, Susan Manila, Alberta, and me, Rhonda Eden, British Columbia. Just as geographical boundaries have been eliminated by travel and technology, cultural boundaries will continue to break down as well as meet and mesh due to an increasingly globalized world. Countries, communities, and companies have become a melting pot of nationalities, cultures, and groups, all affecting and influencing leadership processes and requirements. Many leadership scholars have identified that as the world becomes more globalized, leaders are increasingly being asked to lead culturally diverse teams. Cross-cultural leadership, as defined by Jackson and Perry 2011, is leadership in which a leader attempts to influence activities and goals of a culturally diverse group by appealing to their systems of shared knowledge and meaning. Cross-cultural leadership promotes the development of skills ranging from learning about similarities and differences between cultures and understanding customs and traditions, to practice mindfulness, to cultural cues and behaviors. Cultural intelligence has emerged as a critical competency for today's global leaders. Cultural intelligence is reflective of cultural knowledge and behavioral skills applied by a leader to effectively manage in today's increasingly globalized world. Jackson and Perry 2011 identified that a whole genre of works have emerged aimed at providing guidance on how to develop cultural intelligence. Works by Hickson and Pugh 2001 and Hooker 2003 provided a laundry list of cultural do's and don'ts for leaders to follow. In their foundational work on cultural intelligence, Thompson and Inkson presented a three-step roadmap for leaders towards cultural intelligence. In contrast to other works in the genre of cultural intelligence, Thompson and Inkson focus more on developing cultural mindfulness as opposed to specific do's and don'ts. The first step involves acquiring the necessary knowledge of what culture is and what it is not. Global leaders must take their knowledge of cultural differences beyond simple etiquette to maximize their ability to interact across cultures. The second step is to practice mindfulness. Jackson and Perry 2011 summarized cultural mindfulness as the ability to pay attention to cues in the cross-cultural situations they encounter. It is not enough for leaders to know what to do. They must be mindful to identify when they must activate their cultural leadership capacity. The final step includes the development of specific behavioral skills. Once a leader acquires the knowledge needed to excel as a global leader and can leverage mindfulness to identify moments in which the knowledge should be activated, leaders follow through by behaving in ways which allow for productive cross-cultural interactions. As Thompson and Inkson identified, the development of cultural intelligence is a heavily experiential process. Through practice, leaders can continually cycle through these three steps to grow their capacity to excel as culturally intelligent leaders. Why is cross-cultural leadership important? Cross-cultural leadership and cultural intelligence is important because being aware creates a more effective leader. The Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness Research Study, otherwise known as GLOBE, found universal leadership characteristics that influence job satisfaction and commitment. 3 characteristics out of many identified in the article Conceptualizing Leadership Across Cultures by Dixon Castano, Magomeva, and Hartog 2012 were presence of charisma, communication of vision, desire to bring about change. To understand these characteristics as a leader will create more effective teams and increase the success of an organization or business. Hyatt and Simons 1999 stated, "There is huge potential for misunderstanding if a leader is not conscientious of the cultures within their workforce. It is equally important to realize that there are cultural differences within cultures. This is where cultural intelligence benefits the leaders, as most studies in culture are at the macro level, and the theories and concepts make broad generalizations. It is important in a global economy that a leader not only know how to work within their own cultures in the workplace, but also with global partners. Many companies, such as Terrasun Gas, bid on contracts in foreign countries, such as the United Arab Emirates. The Canadian workers have the expertise and work with local crews in the foreign country. It is important for managers to know that their work crews will work differently than their Canadian counterparts. For example, during Ramadan, the workers may not be as energetic from their fasting, so perhaps you alter the workday. Many workers need breaks for prayer. To be most effective, the manager needs to work within the culture to create the most ideal results. It is important to understand what works and what does not work in cultural settings. House, Javidon, Hange, Dorfman, 2002. An organizational cross-cultural experience. Jackie Ryan, RRU student, MA Leadership. Cultural intelligence is also critical from a client-consumer perspective. The Centre for Autism Services, where I work in Alberta, identified that 63% of our persons served are from cultures other than Canadian. From a leadership perspective, it is important that all staff is culturally competent and able to exercise mindfulness, to know when to activate their cultural knowledge, and adapt their behaviors to accommodate the various multicultural needs. Most of the work of this nonprofit takes place in families' homes. The typical Canadian response, to get directly down to business, is not necessarily effective with multicultural families. In some cultures, it is very important to break bread together and build relationships prior to getting down to business. Until the relationship exists, these families will not have trust in their service providers. Some families cannot have male staff in their home when the father or husband is not there. Accommodation is either to provide female staff or do visits only when the father or husband is at home. By being culturally intelligent and practicing mindfulness, leaders can ensure that the multicultural needs of staff and clients are met. Reinforcing cultural intelligence, a strong influence on organizations. Christine Trin, RRU student, MA in Leadership. The only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture. Edgar Shin. The Alberta Public Service continuously strives to achieve cross-cultural leadership. In the Human Services Ministry, an Aboriginal Recruitment and Retention Committee has been working to acknowledge and incorporate the collective and individual wisdom of Aboriginal public servants. This strategy will support cultural intelligence development within the organization and promote culturally sensitive services to Aboriginal Albertans. As well, through provincial child intervention training, connections are made with Aboriginal communities, which helps to develop the cultural intelligence of the intervention workers within the Alberta Public Service. Specifically, the Working with Aboriginal Communities module is delivered on reserves and includes speakers such as First Nations elders, band designates, and directors of the delegated First Nations agencies. Alberta Public Service leaders modeling and reinforcing cultural intelligence will make the necessary shift in the organization, creating a new organizational culture that will have a powerful positive influence on both service providers and service users. In conclusion, cultural intelligence is becoming an increasingly important competency for today's global leaders. Through the development of cultural knowledge, mindfulness, and behaviors, today's learners can grow into tomorrow's global leaders.